Most people think they know the story of Lucifer, but almost all versions of this story are simplified. He is called the devil, the enemy of God, a fallen angel. However, there is one detail that is often overlooked. Before his fall, Lucifer was the most perfect creature that ever existed among the angels. Not the strongest, not the most cruel, the most perfect. In ancient texts, he is called the bearer of light, the one who stood closer to God's glory than most heavenly beings. And that is why his fall became the greatest catastrophe in all of spiritual history. But here arises a question that almost no one asks. If Lucifer was so perfect, why did he decide to fall? What could have made a being who lived in absolute light choose darkness? This is not a simple story about pride. It is a story about choice. And when we unpack it to the end, something much more disturbing becomes clear. The mechanism of Lucifer's fall is remarkably similar to the mechanism of human fall, and if we understand what really happened in heaven, we can see why this story is still repeating itself on earth. In the next part, we will start with what is rarely talked about: who Lucifer really was before his fall, and why, even among the archangels, he was considered exceptional. Let's continue. The perfect angel that almost no one understands. In most depictions, Lucifer looks like a demon: darkness, flames, horns. But this is an image that appeared much later. Ancient texts describe him quite differently. Lucifer was light, not metaphorically. His presence was literally associated with radiance, with harmony, with beauty that went beyond ordinary creation. One of the most famous biblical descriptions says that he was the seal of perfection, the fullness of wisdom and perfect beauty. This is a very strong statement, because angels themselves are already perfect beings. But Lucifer stood apart even among them. His role was not limited to mere service. He was a bearer of light. This meant more than just a title. His existence was connected with reflecting God's glory. Some interpreters believe that it was through him that the heavenly host perceived the greatness of the Creator. Imagine a being so close to the source of light that it begins to glow itself. That was Lucifer, and here lies the first paradox of this story. His fall came as a shock not because he was weak, but because he was too great. There is a hierarchy among angels: archangels, seraphim, cherubim, and it is with this last group that Lucifer is often associated. Cherubim are not just guardians. They are beings who are as close as possible to God's presence. And if these texts are interpreted literally, Lucifer was one of those who stood closest to the throne. That is, he saw what most creatures could not even imagine: light, glory, the boundless power of the Creator. And yet, he was the first to decide to go against this order. That is what makes this story so disturbing, because the fall did not begin in darkness. It began in the very center of light. And to understand how this was possible, we need to consider one thing that is often underestimated. Lucifer had something that not all beings receive: free will. And this is where the most dangerous part of this story begins. The next part, we will examine the moment when the first crack appeared in a perfect being. It did not happen suddenly, and it was not due to force. It began with a single thought, and it was this thought that changed the history of heaven forever. To be continued next, but I ask you not to write in the next part. This is text for voiceover. Of all the creatures that existed in the heavenly hierarchy, Lucifer had one feature that made him more dangerous than any other being. He did not just see the light of the Creator. He was created to reflect it. Beauty, wisdom, and power were so harmoniously combined in him that the other angels perceived him as their natural leader. His presence did not inspire fear. It inspired admiration. And that was precisely where the danger lay. Because when a creature is around greatness for too long, it gradually begins to take it for granted. What once inspired awe begins to seem natural, and what seems natural eventually ceases to seem unattainable. This is how the first crack is born. It is not an explosion of rebellion, not a cry, not a war. First, a thought appears, a thought that seems innocent. Lucifer looked at the light of God, and at some point, a question arose that had never been asked in heaven before. If he is so beautiful, so wise, and so powerful, why does all the glory not belong to him? It was not hatred. Not yet. It was a comparison. Comparison is one of the most dangerous things in any universe, because the moment a being begins to compare itself to the source of order, the illusion of equality is born. And this is where the real story of the fall begins. For Lucifer was so perfect that his own perfection became a mirror in which he began to see himself as the center. What had previously been a reflection of God's glory gradually came to be perceived as his own greatness. And the more the angels looked at him with admiration, the more deeply the new idea took root. Perhaps the order of heaven is not the only one possible. Perhaps there is another way of being. Perhaps light can be more than just reflected. Perhaps it can be taken for oneself. And at that moment, Lucifer ceased to be merely an angel of light. He became the first being to consider the possibility of another power. It was not yet an open rebellion. Heaven remained quiet. The order was not disturbed. The other angels did not even suspect that within one of the greatest creatures, the very logic of thinking was beginning to change. But every fall has one pattern. First, it happens inside, and only then in reality. Lucifer began to see himself differently. And the moment he stopped seeing himself as a reflection of the Creator, he saw himself for the first time as a possible center of power. It was a turning point because from that moment on, his thoughts no longer revolved around service. They began to revolve around the throne. When such a thought arises, it never remains alone. It begins to grow. Lucifer no longer looked at heaven as he had before. What once seemed like perfect order now looked different. He saw hierarchy. He saw power. He saw the boundless power of the Creator. But along with this, he began to see something else, a vast number of beings who obeyed. And at some point, a new idea emerged. If angels are capable of choosing, then they are capable of choosing differently. This is where the quiet revolution began. Lucifer did not declare war. He did not openly challenge God. That would have been foolish. He was too smart for outright rebellion. Instead, he did what all great rebels do. He began to speak, not loudly, not publicly, but convincingly. The angels who saw his greatness listened intently, for before them stood a being they respected, one who was close to the throne, one who seemed almost equal to the light, and that is why his words sounded dangerously true. He did not deny God directly. He asked questions. Is an order in which only one has absolute power fair? Does freedom really exist if the choice is already predetermined? Couldn't the heavenly world be greater than it is now? This is how all great changes begin, not with a shout, with doubt, and doubt is something that spreads faster than any command. Angels who had never asked such questions before began to think, and when a thought appears in the mind, it begins to seek confirmation. Lucifer knew this. His power was no longer only in beauty or wisdom. It was in his ability to persuade. He knew how to speak in such a way that his ideas seemed logical, as if he were simply revealing what had always been obvious. And gradually, those who listened began to gather around him. Not all of them, but enough. Ancient texts speak of a third of the heavenly host, a third of the angels who believed that a new order was possible, that Lucifer could create another world, a world where power and greatness would no longer be concentrated in one center. It was the moment when thought turned into movement. The heavens still looked calm, but beneath the surface, a force was already forming, preparing to change the very structure of creation. And when that force became strong enough, the moment came that changed everything. The moment when Lucifer stopped talking about the possibility of a new order, and for the first time, he tried to create it. Up to this point, it still looked like an idea. Conversations, questions, doubts. But any idea, if it becomes strong enough, sooner or later crosses the line. Lucifer was faced with a choice: to remain what he was created to be, a reflection of light, or to do what no one had ever done before, to try to become a source of light himself. And this is where the story reaches the point where all the nuances disappear. Ancient texts convey this moment through a single phrase that sounds almost like an inner monologue. I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, I will become like the Most High. These are not just words. This is the moment when a thought becomes a decision. And it was after this that heaven saw for the first time what had never existed before: direct resistance to the Creator. Lucifer was no longer just an angel with a new idea. He became the center of a force that openly challenged the order of heaven. And then something happened that ancient texts describe very briefly, but incredibly powerfully. War broke out in heaven, not as humans imagine it, not with swords and flames, as in the fantasies of artists. It was a war of strength, will, and power. On one side were Lucifer and the angels who believed in the new order. On the other was the heavenly host that remained faithful to the Creator. And among them was an archangel whose name means question: Michael. His name translates as "who is like God." This is not just a name, it is a response to the very idea of Lucifer. For at the moment when Lucifer tried to rise to the level of the Creator, a force appeared that reminded him of the main truth of heaven. No one can take the place of the source, and it was in this battle that it became clear that even the greatest created power cannot compare to the Creator. Lucifer lost, not because he was weak, but because any power created by God cannot surpass the one who created it. And then the fall happened. Not symbolic, real. The texts describe it as the moment when Lucifer and those who followed him were cast out of heaven. Instantly, what was once the brightest light became separated from its source, and light, separated from its source, ceases to be light. It was then that Lucifer ceased to be the bearer of light and became the one who would later be called by a completely different name: Satan. But the most important thing in this story is not even the war itself. The most important thing is why it became possible in the first place. Because the reason for Lucifer's fall did not disappear with him. It continues to exist. And that is why this story is still relevant to humans. In the finale, we will examine one disturbing thing: why the mechanism of Lucifer's fall is strikingly similar to what happens to humans. After the fall, what changed forever? Lucifer's fall was not just a defeat, it was a transformation. Until that moment, he was a creature of light, and even when rebellion was born in him, he was still the same angel who once stood beside God's glory. But after the fall, something much deeper happened. He lost more than just his place. He lost the source of light. This is an important detail that is often overlooked, because Lucifer's light was never autonomous. It was a reflection. It existed only because there was a source nearby, the Creator. When that connection was severed, what inevitably happens to any light without a source happened. It went out. And this is where Lucifer's new nature emerges. He did not cease to be powerful. He did not cease to be intelligent. He did not cease to be influential. But his thinking changed. Previously, he reflected light. Now he began to distort it. That is why in biblical texts, he is described not simply as an enemy. He is called a tempter, one who does not create a new reality, but changes the perception of the existing one. And if you look closely, his methods have hardly changed since his fall. He does not coerce, he persuades. He does not destroy order by force. He changes minds. The same tools he used in heaven: doubt, comparison, ambition, he begins to use in the world of humans. That is why the story of Lucifer does not end with the fall. In fact, it is only just beginning, because after the fall, a new goal appears. If he cannot take the place of the Creator, he can try to lead creation away from the Creator. And for this, a creature with the same dangerous trait that he once had is ideal: freedom of choice. That is why the next part of this story takes us from heaven to earth, to the place where man first appears, and where Lucifer does what he once did with the angels. He asks one question, a question that triggers a new fall. Why the story of Lucifer repeated itself with man. After the fall, Lucifer lost not only heaven, he lost the world in which his idea could prevail. In heaven, everything became clear. There were no more doubts. There, they already saw the consequences of his choice. But there was another world. A world that was just beginning its history. Earth. And in this world, a being appeared that was remarkably similar to Lucifer himself before his fall. Man. Man was created with one special characteristic. He could choose. Not like a machine. Not like a programmed being. But as a conscious creature. And that is why man became the ideal place to repeat the old scenario. Lucifer does not come to man as an enemy. He comes in the same way he once came to the angels. Through ideas. Through doubt. Through questions. In the biblical story of Eden, there is a phrase that at first glance seems simple, but in fact, it almost literally repeats the mechanism of his own fall. Did God really say, "This is not a command, this is not coercion, this is a question"? And a question is the most dangerous tool, because when it enters the mind, it begins to work on its own. This is how Lucifer once sowed doubt among the angels, and now he is doing the same with people. Then comes the second step, a promise. You will be like gods. This is almost an exact reflection of what Lucifer himself once wanted. An old desire, an old idea. But now it has been passed on to man. And at this moment, something very important becomes clear. The fall of man and the fall of Lucifer have the same structure. First comes doubt, then comparison, then the desire to rise above the place that was given, and only after that comes the decision. That is why the story of Lucifer is not just a story about one angel. It is a story about a mechanism that repeats itself over and over again, in power, in pride, in the desire for control. And when people think that this story belongs only to ancient times, they miss the most important thing. Because every time a person begins to believe that they can take the place of the source, they repeat the same path, the path of Lucifer. And that is why this story is not yet over. It continues in human history, in people's choices, in every decision where freedom meets pride. And here the main question arises, not about Lucifer, about us. What makes a being truly great? The desire to rise above everything, or the ability to remain true, even when there is the power to take a different path? It is this question that determines how any story will end, even ours. Lucifer's most dangerous illusion. There is one thing that is rarely explained in this story. Lucifer lost the war in heaven, but he did not give up on his idea. His strategy simply changed. After his fall, he realized one important truth. He could not defeat the Creator by force. A direct war was impossible, but there was another way. Not to change reality, to change the perception of reality. And this is where the most dangerous part of his influence begins. Lucifer does not convince people to worship him. That would be too obvious. Instead, he does something much more cunning. He convinces people to worship themselves. This is the same principle that started his own fall. First, people stop looking at the source. Then, they start looking at themselves. Then, they begin to believe that their mind is the ultimate truth. And when that happens, a new center emerges. Not God, man. That is why the story of Lucifer is much deeper than a simple battle between good and evil. It is a story about the struggle for the center. Who determines the truth? Who determines the order? Who determines meaning? Because the moment a being begins to consider itself the ultimate source of truth, it is actually repeating the same idea that once arose in Lucifer. And that is why this story still resonates so strongly. It is not just about angels, it is about the nature of power, about the nature of pride, about the line between freedom and rebellion. And if you look closely at human history, you can see a strange pattern. Civilizations grow, they gain power, they gain knowledge, and at some point, they begin to believe that they no longer need a source. That's when history begins to repeat itself. This does not mean that humans are doomed, but it does mean that the choice Lucifer once made remains possible for any being that has freedom. And that is why this story never becomes just an ancient legend. It remains a warning, because the real danger of Lucifer is not in his power. It is in his idea. An idea that sounds very convincing, but always leads to the same ending: separation from the source, and any light separated from its source will sooner or later fade away. Why the story of Lucifer is not over yet. The story of Lucifer is often told as if it ended long ago, as if it were just an event from the distant past. One angel rebelled. There was a war. He fell. The end. But the real meaning of this story is not at all what happened then. Its meaning is in what continues to happen now. Because Lucifer's fall is not just an event. It is a model of how a being begins to lose touch with the source of truth. It all starts very quietly, not with darkness, not with sin. It all starts with a single thought: maybe I know better. That's how Lucifer's fall began. And that's how most falls in human history begin. First, there is confidence in one's own absolute rightness. Then, there's a desire to take a place that was not intended. Then comes the moment when the choice has already been made. That is why this story is so powerful. It reveals a very uncomfortable truth. Lucifer's problem was not his power, nor was it his pride. His problem was that he ceased to see the difference between the reflection of light and the source of light, and when that line disappears, the fall becomes inevitable. But there is another important point in this story that is often forgotten. Lucifer was created with perfection, and yet he made a choice. Humans are not perfect, but they have the same gift: freedom. That is why this story is not only about the fall, it is about responsibility. Because freedom always means one thing: the ability to take different paths, the path of Lucifer or another. And perhaps the deepest meaning of this story lies precisely in this, not in the fact that one angel fell, but in the fact that every being that has freedom faces a choice every day, a choice between light and pride, between the true source and the illusion of one's own greatness. And it is this choice that determines the ending of any story, even ours.